Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our now fourth event in this term's public seminar series at the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford University. My name is Hanno Brankamp, and I'm a departmental lecturer in forced migration here at the Refugee Studies Centre. The theme for this series is race, borders, and global immobility. And the aim of the series is to better understand the violence that life seekers, refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and people on the move more broadly routinely experience at the hands of states and other actors across the world. Notoriously, this includes detention, deportation, policing, encampment, imprisonment, interceptions at sea, pushbacks, surveillance, abandonment, and racist immigration policies, which impact in particular people racialized as Black, Brown, and Indigenous, and in particular those from the majority world or the global South. Speakers in this series grapple with a wide range of questions arising from these global immobilities: race and racism, coloniality, nationalism, citizenship, belonging, criminalization, bordering, and today in particular, security. And once again, it's an absolute delight to welcome our speaker for today, who might not need introducing for many of you, Professor Catherine Besteman. Professor Besteman's talk has the rather gloomy title, Security Imperialism. Catherine Besteman is a Francis F. Bartlett and Ruth K. Bartlett Professor of Anthropology at Colby College. She's the past president of the Association of Political and Legal Anthropologists and a 2012 Guggenheim Fellow. Her most recent books include Militarized Global Apartheid, published with Duke University Press in 2020, Making Refuge, Somali Bantu Refugees in Lewiston, Maine, also published with Duke University Press in 2016, and she's the co-editor of Life by Algorithms, published with University of Chicago Press in 2019. And her most recent project is coordinating a collaborative public humanities initiative on abolition in Maine called Freedom and Captivity. Now, before I hand over to Professor Besteman, there is a Q&A box down there, which I would urge you and encourage you to use throughout the talk. And at the end of the talk, I will collect the questions and will ask them on your behalf. And so please do submit questions, and we'll have some time for discussion afterwards. Now over to you, Professor Besteman.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hanno, for that warm welcome, and much appreciation to Oxford, the Refugee Studies Center, and the Department of International Development for inviting me to give the talk today. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of summarizing the main argument of my book, Militarized Global Apartheid, and then I'm going to push that forward into some ideas about what I'm calling security imperialism that I've been thinking through over the past couple of years since I finished the manuscript for Militarized Global Apartheid. So a lot of this is thinking in process, and I am really looking forward to your responses, your suggestions, your critiques about the argument that I'm trying to work through and develop here. The global war on terror has also been a war on migrants, waged most particularly by the global north against migrants from the global south. In addition to its more obvious expressions of militarization, fear-mongering, anti-Islamic racism, and civil liberties curtailments in the name of fighting terrorism, the so-called war on terror is also a rearticulation of militarized racial capitalism. Indeed, the war on terror has put the full force of the participating states to work in creating a clearly drawn racialized hierarchy of mobility, backed up by military force that stretches across the globe and reproduces on a global scale, I argue, the very same components that comprised South Africa's odious apartheid regime. So today I'm going to argue that the global war on terror has facilitated the consolidation of militarized global apartheid, which is a term I'm using to describe a system that maintains hierarchies of labor and mobility through military force. Furthermore, tracking the emergence of militarized global apartheid enables a recognition of what I'm envisioning as or glossing as new security imperialisms that have been consolidating since 9/11. While the logics that feed these security imperialisms aren't necessarily themselves new, the global war on terror has propelled their global consolidation and connections with new forms of technological power. The new forms of security imperialism transcend sovereignty, through new alignments of state-based and extra-state, military, technology, and capitalist interests to control mobility, labor, and dissent. The emerging global apartheid apparatus in place by the global north takes the form of, echoing what Hanno said in his introduction, militarized land and marine borders, biometric tracking of the mobile, algorithmic assessments of risk, the criminalization of mobility, incarceration, deportation, passive lethality, and a pass system for guest workers. It depends on agreements between governments and others in the global north and a suite of actors in the global south who are charged with interrupting migrant mobility. It tracks migrants and it stops them at certain borders for detention and deportation. It pushes migrants towards the most lethal routes and modes of travel. It creates new forms of criminality for migrants and for those who aid them. It enables border crossing as a privilege for elites while manipulating borders to extract labor from non-elites. And it uses the language of terrorism and security to justify its actions. The global war on terror did not create militarized global apartheid, but rather consolidated its security logics, weaponized its deployments, financed its capacitation, and reanimated historically sedimental racial formations that are highly localized, but articulated with global imaginaries of race and racial difference. In short, through militarized global apartheid, the global war on terror has made racism legal again. While militarized global apartheid is the apparatus through which global hierarchies of race and mobility are being reforged, I argue that the apartheid apparatus is taking shape through renewed imperial formations, animated by a set of security logics that are ascendant since 9/11, but rooted in imperial and colonial histories. Security imperialism is emerging from and shoring up militarized global apartheid, based in the identification and containment of risky categories of people throughout the globe, in concert with the technological, affective, juridical, and military extension of particular forms of securitization engineered by the global north under the rubric of fighting terrorism. These emergent imperial formations are spatial and technological rather than simply territorial, and they're taking shape through projects that racialize and incarcerate people while securing cosmopolitan class privilege and capitalist extraction across borders. So I'll begin with a quick note on terminology. As used here, when I'm talking about the global north, I'm specifically referring to the countries that today are the primary beneficiaries of flexible capital from Michel Raffaello, and some of the primary perpetrators of imperialist agendas, namely the US, Canada, Europe, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. It includes countries created through diverse but interconnected historical processes, including settler colonialism and negotiations over domestic political hierarchies following the eras of imperialism, colonialism, and the world wars. The global south then includes a heterogeneous group of countries who share a historical experience of colonization or domination as protectorates or overseas possessions. Today, elites in the global south, as well as in the global north, benefit from their shared adherence to and participation in pervasive security and border control technologies that block migrants and confront dissent. Distinguishing between the global north and the global south is not meant to overlook class divisions that pervade the global north as well as the global south, nor is it meant to overlook the global class of cosmopolitan elites who share control of wealth, capitalist interests, access to political power, and the ability to move freely. Nevertheless, the damages of the global militarized apartheid apparatus sit far more heavily on the shoulders of people in the global south than in the global north. Okay, so turning to militarized global apartheid. The phrase global apartheid, of course, is not new. It's been used by two generations of scholars to describe the centrality of white supremacy in structuring the historic and current world order. Detailed historical analyses articulate the precise ways in which white supremacy shaped the emergence of modern liberalism, humanism, and democracy in the US and Western Europe, the management by white settler states of global population flows, especially from Asia, in the aftermath of abolition and after World War I, the impact on European identities of Europe's colonizing projects abroad, and the late 20th century trajectory of globalization. So building on this scholarship, I argue that global apartheid in the world today is expressed in the militarized, racialized control of mobility and labor, and that new forms of security imperialism are being worked through militarized global apartheid to reconsolidate racial hierarchies, securitize capitalist extraction, and promote authoritarian forms of governance. I'll briefly review South Africa's apartheid system, built piecemeal over 4 decades from 1948 to 1990 as a continuum of colonial era policies, just in order to quickly show how apartheid there employed key structures to secure labor, space, and privilege for white people while controlling dissent. The first pillar of apartheid, of course, was the consolidation of official ethno-racial groups and their assignment to specific geographic locations, effected through the mass relocation of Black people to ethnic homelands or townships where apartheid logics claimed they naturally belonged. Second, the South African government purposefully kept homelands and townships for Black South Africans under-resourced and impoverished relative to white areas. Third, passed laws legally regulated Black mobility through a bureaucratic system that policed border crossing from the homelands into white South Africa and within white space in South Africa, using mass incarceration to punish border crossing infractions. Fourth, apartheid laws ensured the exploitability of Black labor. And fifth, apartheid's maintenance required a massive, pervasive, and expensive militarized security apparatus. These 5 elements are now taking shape systematically on a global scale through a constellation of policies and laws that first insist on racialized, nativist, spatial geographies that correlate nation state citizenship and belonging, upheld by the system, the global system of universal citizenship documentation. That second, make life unsustainable in places designated for the racialized underclass through military occupation, capitalist extraction and dispossession, the imposition of austerity policies, trade inequities, and the dramatically unequal impact of climate change. These policies and laws employ captivity, this is third, to interrupt and reject those defined as out of place, undesirable, or risky. And here I'm talking specifically about things like refugee camps, migrant camps, detention centers, deportation places, prisons, offshore holding facilities. The fourth aspect that this constellation of policies and laws affects is the management of labor mobility through a pass system that allows disenfranchised and thus deportable foreign guest workers to cross borders on temporary visas while criminalizing those who attempt to cross without authorization. And fifth, this constellation funds a militarized security apparatus to maintain racialized hierarchies of labor and mobility. This overall apparatus exists to ensure that racialized hierarchies maintained by militarized border security measures continue to structure access to mobility and the ability of those based in the global north to exploit the labor of those from the global south. South African apartheid was a crystallization of imperial and colonial logics into a militarized system of white supremacy and racial capitalism. And these same logics are now reflorescing globally in the form of a global system of militarized apartheid, justified by security logics. The final pillar of apartheid that I just mentioned, the militarized security apparatus built to maintain racialized hierarchies of labor and mobility in the name of sovereignty and security, is where the technologies of security imperialism are perhaps most visible: militarized borders, smart surveillance, risk assessment technologies, and the burgeoning security industry. Militarized borders are, of course, proliferating throughout the world, justified wherever they're built, in language that conflates migrants with terrorists and criminals. Israel and the US have pioneered the transformation of border walls into lethal military operations through militarized patrols and the proliferation of military technologies like drones, watchtowers, radar, infrared, and thermal imaging devices, sensors, blimps, tanks, helicopters, and already developed, although yet to be deployed, robo-snipers. Their progress has been followed closely by the EU's recent proliferation of border walls and deployment of militarized naval patrols in the Mediterranean. These walls are specifically designed to target racialized foreigners prefigured as criminals and terrorists, Palestinians and Africans in the case of Israel, Latinx migrants in the case of the US, and Africans and Arabs in the case of the EU. Countries across the global south are following suit, such as in India's explicitly anti-Muslim walls along its borders with Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Kashmir, the counter-terror walls in the Gulf and Central Asia, and anti-criminal walls in Latin America. As the tools and technologies of security imperialism by the global north to control mobility spark iterations across the global south, walls, of course, become tools of difference-making and hierarchy wherever they're located. Militarized border walls are spectacularly performative, but they're not completely effective at keeping out the mobile, even while ensuring that their journeys are harrowing and potentially lethal. In response, security technology companies are pioneering innovative and sophisticated surveillance, data mining, and algorithmic systems to track border crossers and assess their level of risk long before they've even reached a border in the global north. Because such technologies collect and store biological and physiological information, everything from fingerprints to DNA to iris and retinal scans to facial and gait recognition, their deployment can be particularly attuned to social constructions of race that target certain characteristics to identify travelers then subjected to extra surveillance. The US allows border security technology and officials to employ racial profiling and assessments of risk, and during the Obama administration, even expanded the definition of racial profiling to include religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. These risk profiles then are shared across borders with other governments. Louisa Moore calls smart border systems algorithmic war because they're a new front in efforts to link mobility, criminality, and terrorism into a trifecta security risk of such proportion that militarized responses against risky people, both external to the state and within the state, are normalized. Algorithmic war separates the world into safe and risky populations, enabling militarized interventions against the latter in the name of protecting the former. These intentionally differentiated mobility pathways not only reflect racialized rankings based on colonial hierarchies, but also anti-Islamic paranoias nurtured through the global war on terror and the pre-coding of possible asylum seekers and other migrants from the global south as already suspiciously criminal simply because they are on the move. While countries in the global north are emplacing smart borders against the mobile from the global south, China, Israel, and the US lead the world in turning coordinated surveillance capabilities toward policing and punishing their own residents. Proliferating surveillance and security technologies, the compulsion toward manufacturing hierarchies of risk to define people, and the turn toward militarization to contain those deemed risky offers a potent combination for managing internal populations. Mass incarceration or hyperincarceration is the most obvious and direct outcome, shifting in response to growing calls to dismantle the prison industrial complex to include things like ankle monitors, the monitoring of cell phone and internet use, and other tracking devices, which in effect can target entire communities for surveillance. Security states demand of citizens not only their complicity in allowing secretive security surveillance by their governments, but also their participation in watchful practice through ubiquitous calls to say something if you see something. Watching for the abnormal is predicated on being able to see difference through visually classifying people as out of place or risky and reporting their presence and actions to authorities. The use of such programs distributes responsibility for risk assessment throughout society, including to private transport carriers, making border patrol a responsibility of citizens as well as government agents, and thus enlisting private citizens in the watchful politics of risk assessment. These world leaders in ubiquitous surveillance, like the US, China, and Israel, they then export to other governments models of how secret surveillance can be a tool of authoritarian control and used to target and punish undesirable populations, whether internal dissidents or aspiring immigrants. Countries around the world are taking notice, enacting similar laws, some under the guidance of the US National Security Agency, to spy on and punish those deemed insufficiently patriotic or potentially treasonous. Militarized apartheid redirects public spending toward the industries of militarization, from prisons to weapons to surveillance technologies that claim to securitize against the mobility, criminality, terrorism trifecta. The militarization of security transforms security from something that refers to the reduction of harm to something that's imagined to exist only through the application of military engagements and military technologies, bending the state's expression of security toward the militarization of everyday life. The boon to security industries is enormous. Salaries for CEOs of the US's top 34 defense contractors doubled post 11, while the number of security oriented lobbying firms on Capitol Hill grew from 2 to 543 just in the 5 years following 9/11. By 2014, the European security industry had a combined turnover of about 96 billion euros, and the global homeland security market is expected to reach $606 billion by 2024. Israeli security exports quadrupled in the decade after 9/11. The concept of security has thus been hijacked by the profit-generating possibilities of its militarized forms. So now I'm going to turn to poking around in my argument on security imperialism. The military and security technologies that enact militarized global apartheid normalize the association of migrants with terrorism and criminality, the racialization of migrants, terrorists, criminals, and the authority of the state to manage the mobility of those defined as risky through violent and lethal measures. A set of iterative security logics support these practices across the globe, distilled into security-based imperial formations. Defining empire, as Enseng Ho does, as here I'm quoting, foreign domination without the necessity of presence or possession over expansive transnational spaces and many places, enables an understanding of contemporary security imperialism as a constellation of forces that control mobility, labor, and dissent, while ensuring benefits to capitalists. In addition to ongoing projects of capitalist accumulation by dispossession, contemporary projects of control and domination are wielded through security technologies like border militarization, risk assessments of the mobile and racialized residents, containment of those defined as risky. They are wielded through security policies and rhetorics, the stifling of dissent through fear, influence over foreign governments and institutions, the imperial use of the exception in the name of security. And they are wielded through military interventions involving broad state and or non-state networks to control restive or lucrative territories and populations in the name of security and capital accumulation. In other words, security imperialism's projects are not simply or only state-based, but involve a combination of state, multilateral, corporate, parastatal, and extra-state actors. There's a clear line from the earlier age of European imperialism to the current age of security imperialism. Tracing this line highlights how liberalism developed within the folds of European imperialism with a firm embrace of racism to justify imperial hierarchies of labor, claims to resources, and political power that are now resurging under the banner of security. Looking historically in the post-emancipation context of free labor in the US and the post-colonial construction of a global order of independent sovereign states, liberalism's ongoing white supremacy found new expressions to benefit capital and to ensure that global power hierarchies remained unchanged. Racist projects like the Black Codes in the southern US and the discriminatory treatment of Indian and Chinese workers in the white settler countries to which they migrated for work are examples of how particular governments reconciled liberalism's embrace of free labor with racist projects of labor control for the benefit of capital and white nationalism. The grossly unequal, here I'm quoting Barry Heinous, post-colonial international order set up through the UN Charter and the Bretton Woods institutions ensured that the newly independent post-colonial states remained subject to the hierarchical international regulatory regime set in place by European state-making, a regime designed to ensure capitalist hierarchy and most specifically to benefit the global north. Hart and Negri theorized that the regulatory regime itself had grown into a new form of empire by the turn of the 21st century. And here I'm quoting from them, a series of national and supranational organisms united under a single logic of rule, based in the withering of the nation state, the global networks through which capitalism works, and deterritorialized communication systems not subject to the control of nation states. Writing a few years later, in the wake of 9/11, David Harvey also saw a new imperialism, but one in which a territorially based state exerts political control by, and here I'm quoting Harvey, by preserving that pattern of asymmetries in exchange that are most advantageous to the dominant capital interests working within its frame. Imperialism in this domain, he says, amounts to foisting institutional arrangements and conditions upon others. Harvey notes that the extraordinary violence that neoliberal states have been willing to use on behalf of capitalism to quell dissent through incarceration and the labeling of oppositional movements as criminals and/or terrorists. So emergent security imperialism has its roots in these earlier imperial formations, but the declaration of a US-led global war on terror consolidated a particular constellation of logics across the global north based in the concept of security. A security paradigm, I'm arguing, is now replacing the neoliberal paradigm as the organizing framework for contemporary social life. Liberalism's racisms are now being expressed through the lexicon of security in the constitution of modern imperialism. And this lexicon of security rests on 6 logics, perhaps more, we'll talk about that work in tandem to perpetrate militarized global apartheid. So to my way of thinking, these 6 logics include, first, security logics that racialize suspect populations across borders, with a particular focus on anti-Black racism and vilifying and containing Muslims. A white supremacist security logic informs how the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand coordinate their management of traveler profiles and border regimes through their Five Eyes Shared Intelligence Alliance. An anti-Islamic security logic is also clear, through which the US, the EU, Australia, Israel, China, and India share rhetoric and technologies to pursue anti-Muslim initiatives, such as the use of anti-Palestinian techniques of occupation in the US-led occupation of Iraq. The second security logic are security logics that emphasize and legitimize ever-expanding forms of carcerality to contain people identified as risky. These carceral logics justify the use of incarceration and containment for everyone identified by the other security logics as problematic, from asylum seekers forced to wait in Mexican migrant camps while the US processes their applications, to migrants held by EU-funded militias in Libya, to migrants held in offshore prisons by managers contracted by Australia, to re-education centers for Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang province. The third security logic are the kind that protect cosmopolitan class privilege, in part through protecting capitalist accumulation, as well as the ease of mobility for cosmopolitan elites. Fourth are security logics that reinforce patriarchy, shared across liberal democracies and fundamentalist groups alike, expressed in claims to the right to police and control women's bodies and women's labor. The claim by the US-led coalitions that invaded Afghanistan and Iraq that their campaigns of mass violence were intended to protect women is just one example. Fifth are security logics that model authoritarianism as a legitimate tool and form of governance. Authoritarian logics are reshaping political landscapes with particular implications for the transformation of democratic governance by secrecy, surveillance, and mass carcerality. And then sixth are those security logics that tether the concept of security to militarization, providing the ideological and technological weaponry to carry out the occupations, surveillance, and containment activities that are at the heart of security imperialism. Security imperialism spans borders. It bends sovereignties towards its goals through imposing security requirements, interventions, laws, and practices, and prioritizes the extractive objectives of political and economic elites. It brings the internal policing of suspect foreign and minority others into the same security apparatus as the external identification and containment of risky migrant terrorist criminals, subjecting both to the profit logics of private security contractors. Security states, security contractors, and security corporations work together across the global north to create a shared network of mechanisms to identify, screen, and contain the risky. Well, the concept of the national security state, an empire formed by the national security state, is still useful and accurate for capturing affective, material, and political economic realities of, for example, the contemporary United States. The concept of security imperialism broadens the frame to consider how national security states work in collaboration with other entities to police mobility, control labor, stifle dissent, enhance patriarchy, maximize capitalist extraction and accumulation, and justify authoritarian moves. Security imperialism has not discarded sovereignty, but rather turned sovereignty towards security goals. The exclusivity of sovereignty, differentiating citizens from migrants, is tied to the expansiveness of security imperialism that tries to draw as many people as possible into its orbit. Security imperialism solidifies sovereignty by providing tools for nation states to control and manage mobility and belonging, and it transcends sovereignty by pulling together a broad range of state, non-state, parastatal, and extra-state actors to pursue global security projects that operate according to the iterative, mutually reinforcing security logics I just described a few moments ago. As such, security is not only vested in sovereignty, the defense of control of borders, the management of internal populations, but also in alliances among states and non-state actors that produce mutually agreeable interventions around the world in the hierarchical control of cross-border flows of people, capital, and goods, and the localized clearing or containment of populations for military, capitalist, or authoritarian projects. The participants in these alliances are all pursuing security objectives of their own, whether under duress or in collaboration or even in defiance of the objectives set by powerful security states. Thinking of imperial formations as non-territorially bounded, multidimensional sets of relations characterized by unequal power opens new ways of mapping contemporary projects of security imperialism and for grasping the components of global militarized apartheid. So turning to a brief conclusion, these security logics do not, of course, serve the interests of most people living in the global south, nor many living in the global north either. So who benefits from security imperialism and the militarized global apartheid system which it supports? Fundamentally, the beneficiaries of security imperialism are intended to be those who are to be protected by militarized global apartheid. More expansively, evidence from apartheid spaces being created by security imperialism at work in places like Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Honduras, India, China, Indonesia, and elsewhere show that capitalist military authoritarian interests meet in the creation of spaces that have been cleared of dissent and resistance against the imposition of capitalist modes of extraction and militarized desires for hegemonic control and performance. Security imperialism enables the exertion of power in the absence of responsibility and the devolution of violence to less powerful partners. Security imperialism manages difference through carcerality and control across space, using state borders as tools of imperial control of labor and capital accumulation. But the securitization dimensions of security imperialism transcend nation-state boundaries, linking, as I've said, domestic carcerality to extra-state forms of military intervention, counterinsurgency, and border control. Apartheid in South Africa reached a point of crisis due to its breathtaking expense, its brutality, its substantial internal contradictions, and of course, powerful oppositional resistance movements. So I'm very interested in hearing from you all what you think it will take to counter global militarized apartheid and security imperialism. Thank you very much.
Professor Catherine Besteman, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your research and your your thoughts with us and having quite a lot of time for the Q&A. So that's great. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for all the brilliant questions. Next week, and kind of leading on to the next topic, is Dr. Hannah Cross, who will be talking about borders, militarism, and inequality in global capitalism, reflections on strategies for freedom. So hopefully we'll get some answers to some of the questions that we've thrown up today. So stay tuned for that. And if you haven't registered yet, then please do.